Hi, everyone. Thanks for hopping in the chat and letting us know who is all here and where you're from. I'm already seeing Washington State, New Mexico, Georgia, New Jersey. Yes. Thank you, everyone. We are so glad that you are here. So I am Evelyn Moon. I am Director of Learning and Content Strategy here at Good Grief. And as always, I want to start from a place of gratitude. I am so grateful for the opportunity to spend time with you today, to learn alongside with all of you today. And I want you to know that we appreciate you, whether you are here watching live or watching this recording later on YouTube. And today's session is part of our broader Good Grief community webinar series. So every school year, New Jersey school year, we bring you content, experts, and information because we want to extend the work that we do outside of our centers and into the virtual space. I will also say anyone who's here today live will receive a certificate of attendance via our constant contact system within the next 48 hours. So for those of you who are maybe not familiar with Good Grief, our mission is to build resilience in children, strengthen families, and empower communities to grow from loss and adversity. We do the majority of our work from our two centers here in New Jersey, our original in Morristown, and then our second center here in Princeton, which is where I am seated today. But we've been expanding beyond just our peer support services for grieving children and families, and also supporting schools, hospitals, and healthcare settings, all sorts of different places and spaces to bring the information and the tools and the resources to folks who are interacting with grievers. This is just a big picture view of our work. We have our family support services. If you know a child who's experienced the death of a parent, caregiver, or sibling, and they live here in the state of New Jersey, encourage them to reach out and see if we might be a good fit to support them with our completely free and unlimited peer support services. As I said, we work with schools. This March, our Good Grief Spring Institute will return. We do professional development and training. We work with parents and caregivers. And then I don't need to tell you about the community webinar series because you're already here. But I don't want to keep talking about Good Grief and about us. I'm really excited for today's presenters. So I'll just do a quick introduction. So Jamie is a queer death worker, grief educator, and founder of the Queer Grief Club, an activity-focused grief support meetup group that's dedicated to reimagining grief spaces for LGBTQ plus individuals. Jamie specializes in advocacy for the LGBTQ plus community in bereavement, end-of-life care, as well as medical and aid dying and parent loss. So without further ado, I will stop sharing and turn it over to Jamie. Jamie, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful to be here and to be talking to all of you about this because obviously it's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart and very important. And I just think we can be creating better grief experiences, better grief support for the queer community. So let's just get right into it. I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. Okay, so today we're talking about LGBTQ grief support, cultivating inclusive support, and I will just start off by saying, when I was putting this together, I thought, oh my gosh, an hour, that's a long time. And then I was actually putting it together, I went, oh my gosh, it's only an hour. So what we will go over today is such a brief overview. I'm not going to be able to cover every kind of nuance and piece of the queer experience, because that is the beauty of the queer community, is that our experiences and the things that we need in grief are vast and wide, but just wanted to kind of give people an overview and this kind of beginning to how we can think about the way that identities and kind of intersections of who we are, how we grow up, how we grieve, how someone dies, where we receive grief support, how that all really encompasses kind of how we carry our grief into the world with us, and what that is like. So Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. So I feel like I don't really need to introduce myself as much, but my name is Jamie. I use she, they pronouns. I am a certified death doula and grief and loss educator. I'm a funeral celebrant. I'm the founder of the Queer Grief Club, which is an activity-focused, kind of supportive, peer supportive space that I started this year. It started as kind of an online community, and now I do different meetups in the Portland, Oregon area, and I'm expanding that into some online programming as well. But it was really just to foster kind of a sense of community and ways that we can grieve together, that we can build kind of a network of people where we can share our grief, where we can do things that feel supportive, but that maybe aren't necessarily the traditional grief group supports. So having that is really important, but then also being able to do a movement class together or do a meditation or an art workshop, being able to integrate grief in different ways. And so that was really important to me, and having it queer focused, having queerness be the center of the grief support was really important to me. And before we get too deep into anything, I just wanted to do a quick kind of note on language. When I use the word queer in this presentation, I am kind of using it in an umbrella term for essentially everyone under the LGBTQIA+++ community. So gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, non-binary, intersex, gender fluid, pansexual, all of the things. That is what I am talking about when I'm talking about queer. It's important to note that the word queer has kind of a historical context of being used as a slur against the queer community, against the LGBTQ plus community, and not everyone feels comfortable with this term, even though it has been reclaimed. So, you know, I really like, if you can take away one thing from this webinar, it's really to meet people where they're at and to remind yourself that, you know, queer people are going to have very different reactions to language, to the way that they want to be identified or the way that they want to be spoken about. And it is really best to let them lead you or to ask the questions first, especially if you are not a part of the queer community. In the same kind of realm, I use the word trans as kind of an umbrella term for anyone who identifies as a gender that's different than the one that they were assigned at birth. So that includes non-binary people, people who are gender expansive. I don't believe that trans has to mean a medical transition or even a transition. There are lots of non-binary people that identify as trans. So trans to me in this setting is anyone who is gender diverse in that way. And you know, I really believe that people have the right to identify in the way that feels most comfortable and affirming to them, and that when we can meet people in that, we're able to see them, we're able to witness them in their grief experiences better. And then quickly, gender identity is, you know, what someone's innate sense of gender is. It may or may not correspond to the person's sex assigned at birth. And sexual orientation is very different from gender identity, which is, you know, someone's internal experience of sexual or romantic or emotional attraction to others. So it's really important for people to understand that gender identity, sexual orientation, and then of course, sex is very different. They're all three different things that are going to be very different for each individual person. So why are we talking about queer grief? How is queer grief different? That is one of the biggest questions that I get, especially from providers who are saying like, everybody grieves, right? Like grief is a fundamental part of our life. I don't know really anyone who escapes being impacted by grief. And so why would it be different for queer people? And so we all know that grief is complex and it's difficult and it's painful. And And whether it's the loss of a loved one or a job or a relationship, it's going to affect so many different parts of our lives. But for queer people, kind of the process of grieving is challenged by the lack of inclusive and supportive bereavement care. It perpetuates kind of this invisibility of the intersections of identity and race and class, sexual orientation, with the way that we grieve. And so when we're ignoring those pieces of our identities or of our stories, we're really not feeling seen in the way that we're grieving or seen for who we're grieving. So we're confronted with layers of stigma and isolation, rejection, both in life and death. And it contributes to kind of the way that society at large tells us what and who we can grieve and how we can grieve. We are often criticized for the way that we grieve or who we're grieving. And then many traditional grief support programs and resources are not really equipped to address the unique needs and experiences of LGBTQ folks. So a lot of times people feel isolated or misunderstood or unsupported, or they're feeling like, I wish that I could access something that felt like it was made for me. And as I was looking into statistics, looking for more research on queer grief, it's pretty lacking. There is a lot of statistical information about mental health and about suicide for queer people. And there's a lot of statistics about kind of queer grief in the realm of the HIV/AIDS crisis. But there's not a lot of information. There's not a lot of talking about what queer experiences of grief are like, and how to kind of create more room for that, and how to make sure that queer people are feeling like they can access grief and bereavement support. And so I wanted to tell a little bit of my story and why it's important to me, why this is so impactful. I am no stranger to grief. I lost both of my parents when I was in my 20s. I lost my dad when I was 21 and my mom when I was 28. And I hadn't really considered that queerness could be a part of my story or my grief, kind of the way that I shaped my grief, because when my dad died, I wasn't out. And when my mom died, I was out, but she was supportive. And I still was keeping so much of my identity kind of pushed down and trying not to have it be at the forefront because I was so focused on kind of caring for my mom at the time and dealing with the second loss of my parents, before I was 30. But it wasn't until the pandemic that my partner and I got pregnant. My partner was the person who was carrying our baby. And we tragically lost our baby at 17 weeks gestation, which is about a little over 4 months. My partner had a big belly, and we had picked out a crib, we had names, we had a registry, and we went in one day and we had just a routine ultrasound, and we were told that our baby had died. And in the process that unfolded after that, which was really muddled by homophobic treatment in the emergency care department, by being really dismissed in the way that we were grieving. And then in my search for grief support afterwards, I could not find a place to go where I felt really supported as the non-gestational partner and as a person in a queer relationship. Looking for support in reproductive loss. That's like an incredibly gendered area. I oftentimes was met with, well, there's a dad's group you can go to, and you're welcome to go there, but that doesn't feel affirming to me. And there weren't a lot of couples groups, and if there were, we were oftentimes the only queer person in the room. There was not a lot of understanding for the process that we had gone through, and also the pieces of our grief that we experienced that were very different from the heterosexual couples that we were with. We heard of so many people who felt so supported and who had way different care than we did. And we're in Portland, Oregon, and we are two, cisgender-ish white people. And we were still, with all of that privilege, we were treated horribly and really could not find like adequate grief support. And so then I started to kind of think of like all the ways that my queerness actually has impacted my grief and the way that my grief has changed, and thinking about like, what does it mean that I never got to come out to my dad when he was alive? And what does it mean that my parents can't see me now in the like really expansive and beautiful queer world that I've created for myself? And what is the feeling that I have of the overall like communal grief that I see when I'm watching, all of these bills and the ways that our community is still really ostracized. And so I realized that there's so much more work to be done in creating safer places for queer people to grieve. And so I wanted to sort of go over what are the challenges, what are the things that make queer grief unique, that add kind of these extra layers to what we might think of just, oh, someone's having a grief experience, but like, what are the queer layers that might be intersecting with the way that someone is grieving? And so one of the biggest pieces is disenfranchised grief, which if you work in grief support, disenfranchised grief is when a loss is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, or it can't be publicly mourned, or it doesn't have the same social supports in place that other kind of grief support or losses would have. So it's a loss that's not seen worthy of grief. It's a loss that's not death related. So people who are grieving the loss of family members who are still alive, but who have disowned them for being queer, or grieving parents that they wish that they could have had, that could have been better supports to them in their grief. Grieving for their inner queer child that they feel like they never got to really foster, or never got to like really experience childhood in the way that they wanted to. Stigma around the cause of death, so overdose deaths or suicide, or sex workers. We end up feeling like there's a lot of grief that we can't share, or we don't want to perpetuate stigmas, or society is telling us you don't get to feel grief about that. And so that we end up kind of internally absorbing all of that and feeling really silenced in our grief. Families of origin are a huge part of grief narratives, grief experiences, and queer people are more likely to be estranged from their families of origin, or they might have fragile or distant or difficult relationships. So there might be, queer kids who are having a hard time with their parents, or the people whose parents died, but their parent was not a good support to them in their queerness. Or maybe their parent is queer, but there was a varying degree of like outness. So it's hard to know how to talk about it, or difficult family dynamics. So there's a lot of pain there, or there can be a lot of pain there. And it's important, I think, for people to start teasing apart those pieces and acknowledging the kind of non-death losses or the other parts of the grief experience that might come from these frayed families of origin kind of relationships. The culture of homophobia and transphobia that is well and alive today. In 2023 alone, 525 state bills have been introduced that attack the queer community. These kind of laws, they impact healthcare and they impact grief. They make people scared. They make people fearful of finding services. They make people feel like something is wrong with them, and we are continuing to isolate and really, make harder, more painful experiences for queer people to feel like they are not able to be themselves, or be supported, or they feel fearful to be out and be themselves. And so what I want people to know is that how people die and how we talk about death and how we talk about grief impacts the grief experiences of those left behind. So thinking about the ways that, you know, my partner and I were treated at the hospital versus hearing stories of straight people, and the way that they were cared for when they lost a baby. You know, like why are those two things different? And how is our grief experience is so much, you know, more complicated for us now, because we're having to go through the layers of, what does it mean that we were treated so horribly? And what does it mean we didn't get to have this opportunity, or we weren't offered this and that, you know, and now we feel this sort of way. So like really thinking about the way that people die, how we talk about death, how that's impacting someone's grief experience, and how they feel like seen and supported in that. And we think of that historically in the HIV/AIDS crisis. So, you know, there was a huge stigma associated with HIV that was perpetuated by the media and the government. Queer people were ostracized by their families and the general public. Everyone became fearful. There was so much misinformation about how HIV spread, how AIDS really worked. And so queer people were unable to partake in funerals, to express the emotions over their losses. They were not able to see their partners or be with their partners in the hospital. Healthcare workers were scared to work with HIV patients, left a lot of them without proper care. People were not able to bury their deads. And oftentimes a lot of families pretended like they didn't, like their people didn't die from AIDS. And so that creates this like secretive place where people feel like they have to not be honest about what their experience is, or they're not getting the mourning rituals that they want, or the communal kind of grief experiences and rituals that they want. And so along with that magnitude of loss, which is really like, you know, when we talk about ancestral loss and ancestral grief, I really believe that that is a part of queer ancestral grief. It just created this kind of profound sense of grief within our community that was often suppressed and silenced. And we continue to see that today, kind of through the suicide epidemic that is happening, and also all of the violence and the murders of especially BIPOC trans women. But if we're talking about suicide, you know, 41% of young people seriously contemplated attempting suicide in the last year. And that's a staggering number. And I think that when we talk about this, we are oftentimes not talking about it in the ways that we should. So we think about, we just kind of condense it down to, oh, that's so sad, that's so hard, you know, like there's it seems like trans and gender non-conforming or gender, you know, diverse people are dying by suicide, and what does that mean? But being queer or being trans does not lead to suicide. There is nothing wrong with people who are queer and trans. There's nothing about us that makes us more susceptible to suicide, except for the fact that we experience a ton of stressors and judgment and violence and prejudice that increase the risk for suicide because of the poor mental health outcomes that all of this kind of these systemic barriers and these prejudices affect us. So again, like how we talk about this is really important. And then there's the trans-specific grief experiences. We think about the threat and the reality of violence, including death, which is a significant fear of a lot of people in the trans community. And grieving a second adolescence, so grieving that the queer or the trans child that they wish they could be, or those moments where maybe they knew that they were trans but they felt like they couldn't come out in that yet. Body and gender dysphoria can be a grief experience. Friend, family, societal reactions to transition can be a grief experience. Fear of sharing even their grief experience in their transition for fear of people going, oh, look, you have grief around this and maybe you shouldn't be doing it. Or fear around, you know, being a passing person, meaning like they are passing for cisgender. Sometimes there is grief when you get to the point of feeling like you pass for a cisgender person, but then people aren't seeing your queer identity. They're just assuming you're in a either a hetero relationship or you're a cisgender person, and you want your queerness to be seen, and also you want to be seen as, you know, the gender identity that you are presenting. So there's a lot of different layers, and there's a lot of different grief experiences that we are not naming as grief. And I think it's really important that we start acknowledging those, and then start looking at, and what are the barriers? Like how, so there's a ton of grief experiences, and so many that I didn't name. They're a part of being queer. There are so many ways that queerness and transness kind of interact with our grief experiences. But then what are the barriers? Like, what are the barriers to getting affirming and inclusive support? And we look at this graph by the Trevor Project, and we think about, like, what are the reasons that people wanted mental health care or grief care, but were unable to get it. And a lot of that is fear of discussing mental health care concerns, fear of not being taken seriously, fear of, you know, affordability and like actual access issues. And we think about, like, when people do start to access care, oftentimes they are getting inequitable care or discriminatory care, or even at times are receiving harmful care. And so traditional grief spaces oftentimes aren't making space for queer experiences, so they become kind of inaccessible or unsafe for queer people, because you walk into a grief support space and you don't feel seen, or you feel like you have to constantly explain yourself over and over again, or you're asking people to please honor and respect your identity or somebody else's. So a few things that just kind of make grief spaces inaccessible, in my opinion, for queer people. Misgendering is a huge one. Misgendering of the person who's receiving support. I have talked with people who were like, my counselor would not get my pronouns right, or they could not, like, there was nothing on the forms that showed pronouns. I tried to tell them, and I couldn't go and continue to get misgendered every time I wanted to talk about grief. Or misgendering of the person who died. What a horrible experience to be talking about the person who died and someone is not referring to them with the right pronouns, or not referring to them as the right gender, or not using the correct name. Exclusion of chosen family, or these kind of heteronormative expectations in grief spaces. So that's like gender specific loss groups, which yes, are important, but also making sure that if we are having gender specific loss groups, that there needs to also be equitable and inclusive groups as well. Heteronormative structures, which dictate kind of who's able to receive support, these ideas of traditional nuclear families that are recognized over chosen families. So you think about, like, who gets bereavement leave and who gets sick pay and who gets to go, you know, like, who is worthy of getting the grief support. Where are the grief support for friend loss, or for someone, or just like bigger communities losses, or sometimes people have chosen families that are bigger parts of their lives that feel just as devastating as, say, a bio mom. But these kind of heteronormative structures that we've created of these, this nuclear family and like a sister or a brother or a mother, you know, these are what you get kind of grief support from. But when people live outside of those boundaries, which we do, we create these beautiful networks of families and communities for ourselves. When we're not able to access grief care for that, or we feel like, where do I go to talk about this loss? It ends up having people feeling really alone and isolated, and like maybe that's a grief that they don't get to have. We talk about compounded losses, the multiple losses with multiple layers. There's oftentimes people, especially queer people, are experiencing multiple losses at a time. And it's hard to know where to put them all. And so trying to find support when supports are very kind of in these boxes can feel really frustrating. There's nothing that fits what my experience feels like. Complicated grief, so difficult relationships with the deceased, or layers of grief that are associated with gender identity or sexual orientation, or the person who is grieving is not even recognized as someone experiencing grief. So I have seen partners who have been completely dismissed by families as not having a grief experience, or people who have really complicated relationships with their parents and don't know where to go to talk about how to grieve someone who disowned you, or how to grieve someone who made you feel horrible about who you were. Stigma and shame. So stigma attached to how someone has died, stigma attached to what someone's relationship was like. So what someone's relationship structure was like, or people who are in polyamorous families or have multiple partners. Stigma attached to someone's identity or other intersecting identities, so sex workers, or other people who our society kind of dictates the way that we view these people. And then one of the biggest pieces that I've found is pathologizing grief, which is anyone who's experiencing systemic oppression. So and a lot of people, a lot of queer people are kind of at the intersection of these other identities, so BIPOC, or mentally ill or disabled or unhoused communities. They are disproportionately criminalized in their grief. When people are going and trying to get grief support, they are more likely to be involuntarily hospitalized, or to be in forced treatment in psychiatric facilities, or to be incarcerated, or to be subjected to violence at the hands of law enforcement. So you have someone coming in and talking about real grief experiences, or saying things like, I don't want to be here anymore, and instead of asking further what that means, instead of knowing ways to talk about suicide, or to talk about living with suicide, or suicidal ideations, oftentimes we are more likely to kind of act on instinct and go, oh, you just, this needs to be addressed. And we bring in, what feels like punishment to people. So instead of feeling seen or supported and witnessed in their grief, more often than not, our grief experiences as queer people are shaped by shame and invisibility and fear of saying the wrong thing, or having someone judge us in our grief, or having somebody feel like they're questioning our grief experiences. And so this leads to a lot of people feeling unsafe, exhausted, resentful, like they can't share their grief in spaces like they want to or they need to, and they don't know where to do that. And so it leads to a lot of isolation, and these like more complicated grief experiences that people carry with them. And so we can do something about that. That's the great part about all of this. And this is the uplifting part. So there are things that we can do to create better grief experiences, to honor the grief experiences of queer people, to make sure that we are doing inclusive work, and that we're really seeing people for who they are, and what their grief experience is like. And so I talk about creating a safer space. We hear the word safe space all the time, but safe means a lot of different things to different people. So, and safe spaces don't always allow for challenging things, for growth, for being able to repair, for the kind of the messy parts of it, which I think is really necessary to really building better and stronger communities. So safer space means creating an inclusive environment that promotes safety and support, but it allows everyone to kind of freely express themselves and share their experiences without the worry of discrimination or prejudice. So a safer space honors the unique experiences of people when they are present and when they're not present, and aims to create a space that's really culturally sensitive, inclusive, and open. A safer space is where you might get it wrong, but a safer space is also a place where you're committed to getting it right. So here are some inclusive grief support practices. Again, this is a list that could be much, much, much longer, but just to kind of start thinking about these things in the way that we are creating our practices, the way we're working with people. So listening and affirming, of course, if anyone's doing this work, I hope we're all listening and affirming, but practicing that active listening, the empathy, and really honoring and respecting someone's pronouns, their identity, and their chosen name. So I want people to be able to share who they are, and for providers to listen and to say, yes, I believe you, to use the name that they chose for themselves, or that they would like to be called, to use someone's correct pronouns, to use the deceased person's correct pronouns and identity, and for people to really to listen to queer people and to affirm that what they're feeling is real. And I think that that's where, you know, a lot of the times we end up feeling like we're trying to get, we're getting talked out of what we're feeling. Oh, that maybe, oh, I'm not sure if that was transphobic, or I'm not sure if, are you sure it really has to do with your queer identity? Like, believe people, affirm what they're feeling, affirm who they are, trust them when they tell you who they are. Confront your own biases, unlearn your own assumptions. Like, when you see someone who looks like me, and I'm standing with someone else who, you know, has a femme or woman presentation, do you immediately think we are sisters or friends, or do you like think about the possibility that we could have any kind of relationship? Where are your growth edges? What are the parts of queerness or of any of this where you feel that, ooh, you know, yes, I support everybody, I want to provide this inclusive support, but this is what I really struggle with, or I have a really hard time with this. How can you kind of take that and continue to work on it and continue to push yourself in those arenas? So where are you falling short? Where do you need to learn and grow? Recognizing the unique challenges that are faced by queer folks in the grieving process. So even starting to acknowledge those, or help, you know, clients or patients connect those dots, and seeing where, you know, asking even about identity, not pretending like it doesn't exist. Practice person-centered care. My favorite question to ask people is, what do I need to know about you in order to give you the best support? What do I need to know about your family? What do I need to know about your person? How would you describe your relationship? Or how do you think they would have described their gender? You know, really being curious and letting people tell us kind of what their relationship was, giving, letting them tell us the language they want to use, and really, again, affirming them in that too. Language is huge. Language is important. When introducing yourself, please model by sharing your pronouns. It's really, it's the easiest way. I hear from a lot of practitioners that they worry about pronouns. They worry about asking about pronouns. And so if you feel uncomfortable with asking about pronouns, you can just share your own, model that, so that people understand, oh, this person pays attention to pronouns. they might not answer back. And that's fine. Some, but if I'm a queer person walking in to receive grief support and someone introduces themselves and says, and my pronouns are this, then I know that I can share mine, and I would hope that they will be respected. But I will say that pronouns, yes, incorporate them into your email signatures, the name tags, the forms, names displayed on lines and groups. It is only as important as actually putting it into practice. So you can have your pronouns on your email signature, but if you are not calling people by the correct pronouns, then you are not being a queer inclusive practice. So again, it's making sure that your actions are aligned with kind of what your words are, making sure that paperwork is inclusive. There is nothing more frustrating than having to constantly cross out things on paperwork like father or husband or whatever, like making more space for gender identity boxes that are not just male and female. This really helps people feel like they are being seen for who they are and for all parts of who they are, and that they're not expected to fit into these boxes that we've kind of created for ourselves. Confidentiality is huge. So providing treatment without judgment or bias, using the patient's pronouns and name. And then reminding yourself that also HIPAA requires healthcare providers to protect the privacy of individuals seeking gender affirming care. So to really, create that sense of safety and trust and confidentiality with the people that you work with. While I hope that someday we will all be able to be out in whatever capacity we want to, that is not the case for everyone. So just again, checking in with people about confidentiality and what is shared, creating more spaces and supportive spaces to discuss suicidality and living with suicidal ideations. There's a lot of amazing trauma-informed folks who are trained about talking about this. There are suicide doulas who help people kind of learn to deal with these kind of thoughts. If you can provide, spaces where clients are safe and that they're not a danger to themselves, but can talk about this without having to worry about getting institutionalized, that is huge. Breaking free from kind of our own limiting views on grief. This kind of goes back to like thinking about our own internal biases and our kind of shortcomings in the way that we think about grief. Like, are we limiting ourselves in who we think is appropriate to grieve, or what we think is appropriate to grieve, or what expressions of grief are appropriate? And so what has shaped your views on that? And how can you continue to kind of expand your mind or meet your people or your clients where they are at? Dismantling the systems that might perpetuate complicated grief experiences for queer folks. Like, who does your employer or the insurance company deem as legitimate for bereavement leave, and why? And can you change that? Or can you make a company policy that says, we're going to give bereavement time if you ask for bereavement time. We're not going to ask you to justify it and say like, oh, is this like a nuclear family member? So starting to realize the places where we're creating boundaries for people around their grief. Creating queer specific grief spaces. Queer grief spaces are magic. I mean, the community, the way that people come together when I do a queer grief club is so special. And a lot of people have experienced rejection or marginalization from their families already, or communities or religious institutions. A lot of people feel like they can't go into a grief support group if it's at the basement of a church. But creating queer specific groups is going to create a safer space for queer people to show up. And then those conversations really start flowing about queerness and how it relates to grief. it kind of helps bring this sense of belonging. It helps people feel less alone. And it will be filled, I promise. I think a lot of people are like, oh, I want to create a queer specific grief space, but I don't know if anyone will come. I promise you they will come. It's needed. Growing, learning, get it wrong. I think that's the piece that I want people to know, is that getting it wrong is okay. It's all about how we repair and change our course and direction. And so we are not always going to get people's pronouns right. We are not always going to show up for people in the way that they want us to. But being open to that, being willing to try again, being willing to just kind of course correct and say, oh, thank you so much. You're right. They, them pronouns, carry on. One of the more disappointing things I think that a lot of people have started to express is when people who are not from the community do mess up on pronouns, or they do make a mistake, that they kind of go into a big, long apology tour, or, oh my gosh, this is just so confusing for me. I'm so sorry. And it becomes kind of then placed on the griever, on the queer person, to go, oh, it's okay, it's fine, and go into a reassuring mode. So I'm always reminding people, if you get it wrong, just, thank someone for correcting you. Do it better next time, and keep going. Don't let that stop you from continuing to provide inclusive care. Refer queer providers, find the queer death doulas or the queer grief workers in your area, or artists, or organizations that you can refer out to. Providing those kind of tailored resources and support can be really, really beneficial in also having people feel like you are seeing them for what they might need. So if you are feeling like you have someone that you're working with who needs a little more attention, or maybe would want to work with a queer provider, refer them out, show them that care through offering that, or having the resources that are queer specific. So kind of all in all, reminding people that community connection, freedom to express oneself authentically, support from loved ones, non-judgmental healthcare providers, all of this really greatly impacts the bereavement and grief experiences for queer people. And when we are creating better, more supportive grief experiences for people, which, when I say better, I mean, nothing is going to make grief better. I think most of us know that. But when we feel seen and held and witnessed, and really affirmed in what we are grieving, who we are grieving, and who we are, then we are able to kind of move through the world in a different way, carrying our grief with us, instead of feeling the kind of shame and darkness that comes with feeling like we can't access grief support for the grief that we're feeling. So I always want to be a resource. I always want to be help to whoever might want it, or who is looking for better support, or wants to collaborate, or want to kind of imagine new ways to show up for their clients. So please stay in touch, and I will make sure all of these slides are sent out to everyone. But I would love for you to feel free to send any questions my way, or to just stay in contact. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to go back and open up the floor for questions or comments, or anything else that you'd like to discuss in these last 10 minutes.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat, and there was definitely some curiosity around where they could find more information on suicide doulas. I saw overdose doulas came up in the chat, and it's also okay if this is something we send as a follow-up, but was wondering if you had some information sort of top of mind.
Yeah. I know a really great death doula who does a lot of work around this, I think, who's maybe based in Colorado. And there are like little booklets and things that they have created that they talk about, like these should be in our like first aid kits of how to talk to someone who's maybe experiencing suicidal thoughts, or how to kind of support someone who might be in a crisis. And so I will be sending that out. I have a list of resources of people and different resources that can be really helpful for that, and things to add to your toolkit in supporting people. And I'm just always really amazed at the education and the focus. I think that's where death doulas are really amazing, because so many of us want to have specific focuses. And so there end up being, I think I saw someone who was like, oh, there's an overdose, someone who does overdose doula work. So again, like having those focuses, having people who are really focused on what does it mean to support someone who's grieving an overdose death, or what does it mean to support someone who's died by suicide, or who is experiencing a loss and also grappling with not wanting to be here. And so there's a lot of different ways that that we can kind of continue to bring in community and people with a lot of different expertise to create better grief support for folks.
I'm also seeing a lot of appreciation in the chat. I love this one from Colin. I really appreciate that you are framing grief in many different types of losses. I think that is a really simple and yet profound change in the angle of work and discussion.
Yeah, I think that is such a big piece, is that we're not naming things as grief experiences. And especially for the queer community, there are so many grief experiences that are not associated with traditional death losses. And that just goes into, like queer people, we have already disconnected from binary thinking. Like grief can only be associated with sadness, and it can only be associated with death. And there is such a bigger spectrum of what grief, what loss looks like, and then also like how we support ourselves and how we live and move through the world with our grief and our losses, that are so much more beyond the binary of kind of what grief support looks like right now. So that's really kind of part of my motivation too, is just to also like make more room for the grief experiences that we don't talk about, but that are very real and very there.
I'm seeing
Yes, I do love Return to Zero, and I found them recently, or not recently, in the last couple of years, and they do have a great LGBTQ kind of section, and they offer LGBTQ groups now, which is really great. And I'm so grateful to see more and more queer specific groups kind of popping up, and to see the ways that we're showing up for each other and ourselves. And yes to the Funeral Director's Apprentice. Yes. Yes, for us, by us. That is what is so important to me, and that the death care industry needs a lot of work, for sure, and funeral planning and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah.
Well, I'm seeing more connections. Yes, LCSW licensed funeral director. Wonderful.
Oh, I love that. Yay. I mean, I'm always building lists of people. So, if you have an offering, or if you are already doing kind of queer inclusive grief support, or you have specific queer groups, like please send them my way. I love being able to refer folks. And I get inquiries from people all over. So I like being able to have resources in different states both on the West Coast and the East Coast and everywhere in between. So, and always happy to connect with other practitioners or people who are really committed to this work.
Yeah, I saw a request for Canadian resources.
Oh yeah, there't a lot of great Canadian resources. Absolutely. There's oh gosh, I'm blanking on it now, but there, I'll make sure it's in the resources list, but there's a lot of actual like queer death care and grief supports resources in Canada, which is really amazing. And sometimes I'm like, do I need to go to Canada? So yeah, there's a lot of really amazing things that are growing, and that does give me a lot of hope. And I know that, you know, we can continue to support our queer community better. We can always do better. And also it's really great to look at the things that are happening now, and to look towards the future of how we can continue to, you know, live in a better grief accepting society. Thank you so much for all of these comments. I really, really, really appreciate them. And yeah, I'm just going back and reading through the chat. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And just please use me as a resource, or feel free if you ever just want to connect. You can use my email or find me on Queer Grief Club on Instagram. That's the best place. Will be unveiling a newsletter or a Substack in the new year, and having some more online programming and trainings and stuff too. So yeah, stay in touch.
All right. So before you all hop off, just wanted to make you aware of what is coming. And thank you so much, Jamie. This was really wonderful, so needed. We're really appreciative to you for joining our community today. I just put a ton of stuff in the chat, but this coming new year, I can't believe that it's almost January, but we have Tapping the Power of Mindfulness to Navigate Stress. This is with Diana. She is a mindfulness educator and a Good Grief team coordinator. So we are going to look at the role of grief and mindfulness. Then in February, my colleague Annette will be presenting our very first fully in Spanish community webinar. So please, if you have Spanish speaking friends, families, professionals, please have them attend, because this is our first time doing something like this, and we really want to make these resources available. And then in March, we have Sarah King from Sarah King Creates. She will be doing Scribbling Hope. So it's vision journaling, but not necessarily writing. So if you go, oh, I don't like to write, or, oh, I'm not a good artist, she is going to walk you through a process in which we can process our grief through vision journaling and scribbling and art. But as always, if you need anything, you can reach out to me. I'm Evelyn with 2 M's at good-grief.org. We have our resources. We have our YouTube channel. I also popped a survey in the chat, but you'll get that as well from our follow-up communication. So be on the lookout. If you don't see anything from me, check your spam. Sometimes I get flagged as trying to advertise to you. But thank you so much for your time, your attention, your presence. Thank you again, Jamie. Really appreciated you joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.